Hello, Yakri here with another Artifact video. This time I want to talk about sort of the history of the trading card game genre as we know it today, and how that's led to Artifact and what some of the inspirations and influences on the game are. There's a good bit of discussion about that from time to time, but it mostly consists of troll posting, shit posting, and I thought it might be interesting to make like an informational video for people who are not really card game aficionados, those of you who are just kind of getting interested in this because it's a Valve game, or because Hearthstone got you into the idea of card games, but it wasn't really your sort of game, and you're more into something with a bit more depth, like Artifact seems it's going to have, and so you don't really have a big familiarity with all this stuff. For me, I grew up with a lot of these games, so it's kind of right up my alley. But I thought it'd be interesting to cover, right? So, card games kind of got their start with Dungeons and Dragons in 1970, or 1974, but in the 1970s. And that's because, of course, Richard Garfield, who is the creator of Magic the Gathering and is also the lead designer behind Artifact, created Magic the Gathering after being inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, according to him in I forget when he said this, but I believe it was in some interview. And of course, Peter Atkinson, who he worked with on Artifact, founded Wizards of the Coast. So Magic the Gathering has a lot of really obvious D&D influences, I think, right? Like, you have creatures, which have attack and defense. It's very fantasy-oriented. And it's got a lot of D&D themes. You've got wizards, spells, dragons, fantastical factions and whatnot. You got demons and all that shit. So it's a very... I think there's a lot of artistic influences and lore influences, as well as some actual mechanical influences, right? And it seems to have a lot of roots in RPGs in that sort of era. And Magic the Gathering, of course, inspired every other card game in the genre as we know it today. I believe there were some other games that came out around the same time as Magic the Gathering, close enough that maybe they were, like people having similar ideas or around the same time. But although I had to read a few Wikipedia sites through Google Translate that didn't have English versions, I think our Magic the Gathering was the first one to come out. And it's definitely the only one that actually has this style, right? The kind of RPG-esque, summon creatures, cast spells, use items and enchantments and that kind of thing. And a huge amount of that carries over to other games. So Richard Garfield over here is linked to a lot of these things. Some of them directly, and of course, because he created Magic the Gathering, he's kind of the father of the genre. He's had a huge impact on a lot of the games in here. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the other things he's created and how I think that ties into his design philosophy and what he's done with Artifact. But first, let's talk about Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Because Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh were like the first follow-up games to Magic the Gathering, excuse me, really. And Pokemon didn't really do anything special. I didn't play Pokemon as much as I played Yu-Gi-Oh, but from what I reviewed and what I remember, it's very similar to Magic the Gathering, but it's focused around Pokemon and the Pokemon's abilities, right? Because it's a Pokemon card game, but it didn't really do anything interesting, and my impressions of it, even as a child, were very bland, and reviewing it as an adult, I don't see much to talk about there. Yu-Gi-Oh, on the other hand, although it has many faults, did a few interesting things. So, there are concepts like trap cards, very cool, I think. It's a different take on sort of counter spells. But probably the most interesting thing is the summoning mechanic. In Yu-Gi-Oh, you can just summon weaker monsters. You only get a limited number of actions to do this per turn. And then you sacrifice weaker monsters to summon stronger monsters. And so I think this may have been the first sort of attempt to replace the Magic the Gathering land system. And the land system in Magic the Gathering, I think something like it is needed, right? You need something like the land system in Magic the Gathering in order to sort of foster more tough choices in design space. If you don't put any restrictions on your players, things become a little too easy. If you didn't have any land colors in Magic the Gathering, it would be too easy to build a deck list of cards, right? It is a balancing aspect to it that if you can't easily pick up all the best, cards at doing some particular task from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colors simultaneously without any drawback. When you can't do that, it means that maybe you need to drop some of those, cards that do something particularly well in favor of other options. So some sort of mana system is essential, I think. Basically every card game has kind of replicated it in some way, some sort of drawback that you have to work around. Yu-Gi-Oh's is pretty different, but Hearthstone does a very similar thing to Magic the Gathering, actually. I think more similar than many people give it credit for, or give Magic the Gathering credit for, depending on how you look at it, with their class system. The class system is essentially a very rigid replacement of the colored mana system in Magic the Gathering. You're just stuck with the cards for whatever class you have, plus cards that any class can use. Elder Scrolls Legends does a similar thing where if you want to have a 2-color deck versus a 3-color deck, 3-color decks have a minimum number of cards that's higher than a 2-color deck to penalize you. And there's I think there's rules about the ratios. I forget. It's been a while since I played it. And I don't actually know if what SoulForge did in that regard. It's mostly notable for other reasons. So before I go any farther with that, no, I take it back. Let's go farther with that. Artifact, I think, has the most interesting solution to this, which is the heroes, right? The heroes in Artifact are the replacement for lands in Magic the Gathering. Instead of having to draw into the correct lands, instead of having lands be part of your, draw step, and as a result, mulligans are very important in Magic the Gathering. I will say, as a side note, I don't agree with this sort of view that a lot of people have, mostly new players, that, you get mana screwed all the time. You don't get mana screwed all the time. I get mana screwed once in 40 games. It's not a very common occurrence if you know what you're doing and if you build your decks well. You get mana screwed once in a while, though. It can happen, right? You can have bad enough luck for this to happen. It's just not a very huge problem, statistically speaking. But it is still a problem. So in Artifact, you have your heroes reliably. You start the game with 3 of them. You get 2 more over the next first 2 rounds. And if they die, they respawn. And they determine whether or not you can cast spells of a particular color in a particular lane. And you also have a mana counter like in Hearthstone. And additionally, having the 3 lanes, right, is a neat factor as well, so that you have multiple opportunities to empty your mana pool. It changes how mana curves work, and I think it impacts how meaningful it is to be stuck with a bunch of high-cost cards in your hand, because you can play a bunch of high-cost cards at once, drop them in a big wave around turn 7, 8, and it makes a really big impact. It's not as essential, also as a consequence in Artifact, to play cards every single turn on your curve. And I think it takes some of the focus away from having the right opening hand and the right cards, and puts more focus onto making the right choices as the game progresses. I think that's very interesting, the way that that's happened in Artifact. So let's dial it back a bit, and let's talk about these other games I've listed here from Richard Garfield. And these both came out before Pokemon, if I didn't get the Pokemon date wrong. But Netrunner, right? Netrunner is a really well-known one among card game aficionado types, and it's a little more well-known these days because of Android Netrunner. Now, I played Android Netrunner, not the original. However, I looked up the original when I was preparing to do this video, and I noticed something really interesting about it, which is that the original had a blind bid system. And I don't want to get bogged down in the details of it, but essentially, you would have to do a blind bid against your opponent, and you would want to get them to spend more, and you would want to spend less. And depending on the situation, you might be willing to spend a lot to make sure you spent more than them. Maybe you spending more than them was what was important to you. And sometimes you don't really care about spending a lot. You just want to make sure that your opponent spends a lot. And that's a kind of really mind game heavy mechanic, right? It's just a blind bid. There's not some fancy mechanical aspect to it per se. There were some mechanical influences, I think, but it's all about bluffing your opponent. It's all about thinking, getting inside their head and figuring out what they're going to do so you can exploit that. And I think that is really the primary theme of Richard Garfield games and the games inspired by Richard Garfield games. It's probably no surprise. I mean, bluffing and as well as reading your opponent are the primary aspects that allow anyone to be skilled at poker, for example, at all, right? That's how any skill component enters into that game. And so it's not too surprising that trading card games, although they're very different in many ways, keep that aspect. So I think that's important to recognize going forward, because I think it's a huge focus in Artifact. In fact, I think a lot of mechanics have been cut from Artifact, or it's been designed around not having them, in order to bring more focus into making, intelligent strategic decisions and bluffs and reading what your opponent's going to do, and playing cards based on that will give you an advantage. And I think that's also really reflected in What Were You Thinking, which is a really interesting game. And there was actually a wave of phone trivia apps a while back that were, I think, inspired by this. And the concept is that you would, answer trivia questions, and you would want your answer to be the most common answer, right? So you've got a group of 8 friends. You don't answer the correct answer. You answer what you think the most other people will answer. And the more people answer the same thing as you, the more points you get. Doesn't matter if you're right. That's a very reading people skills kind of thing. How well do you know the people you're playing with? How much can you get inside their heads? How charismatic are you? How much can you, kind of pull people along into your way of thinking and get people thinking about what your answer is going to be, that kind of thing, right? So mind games, all about mind games, right? And so I think that's really cool. Actually, that's the part of card games that really appeals to me personally. Building cool decks is also a lot of fun, as well as combos, but I think that's like the biggest appeal for me personally. So I think Artifact is really focused around that. Hearthstone was a step in a different direction, actually, maybe even the opposite direction. So Magic the Gathering has a big focus on that as well, but a lot of the focus on that in Magic the Gathering really bogs the game down, right? You've got counter spells and all this stuff where, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I should change my terminology on this a bit. There are a lot of times where you have to wait for your opponent. And your opponent is rewarded for making you wait, because even if they can't do anything, even if they don't have a reason to make you wait, they want you to think that they have a reason for making you wait. Sometimes. And other times, they have a reason to perhaps quickly pass back and forth and not make you wait, to make you think that they don't have anything that they can do about your actions, but they potentially can. So there's a lot of high-level thinking mind game stuff in Magic, but it bogs the game down very much. And I think Artifact is kind of an effort to get that kind of gameplay in terms of where your headspace is at, where you're thinking, and what type of skill makes you good at the game, but without the bogging down of the game. Hearthstone just cuts it out and replaces it with something really in your face, right? Hearthstone, it takes the focus away from this sort of like getting into your opponent's head and whatnot, into just do your own thing. That's what Hearthstone's motto is. Do your own thing. You're on your turn, and not to say that other stuff isn't still somewhat fairly important, right? But you do your own thing, you're on your turn, and you block creatures, and you attack things, and you summon your stuff, and then it's your opponent's turn, and they do their own thing, right? And you can almost just like not pay attention to what they're doing. You can go do your other stuff, and you come back, and you can see where the board state is at, and then just do your own thing again. And you can play Hearthstone pretty effectively like that. It's not ideal, but at very high levels of play, I'm sure it becomes more of a factor. But I accidentally delete or move the Yu-Gi-Oh date. There was a date for Yu-Gi-Oh here. I swear. Oops. Anyway, yeah, so Hearthstone really walks it back from that a bit. And I think Elder Scrolls Legends kind of just stays at the Magic the Gathering level. It's very, very much closer to a Magic the Gathering clone than Hearthstone is. And let's see. How do I wrap this up? So SoulForge and Elder Scrolls Legends, I think, are the last two things I really need to talk about here, as well as the inspiration that I think Artifact does draw from Hearthstone. So SoulForge and Elder Scrolls Legends are notable because they have multiple board mechanic, or a multiple lane mechanic of sorts. Neither of these games really did a good job on it, I don't think. SoulForge is a failure for a lot of reasons. Its lane mechanic is really similar to what you see on a single board of Artifact, right? I don't recall off the top of my head if units could attack like neighbors, but units would be in these slots, right? And the slots like are head-to-head, and they would fight each other. And you can play units to the different slots. Yu-Gi-Oh kind of functions a similar way. It's not quite the same, but you do have slots. Artifact has those slots, but they're per board. They're infinite on each board. And you've also got, a lot of other complex stuff with cards moving around going on. And I think that's having the 3 boards, as well as the slots, the little like lanes inside of the lanes is really interesting, I think, in terms of developing this mechanic. Elder Scrolls Legends kind of was a total failure with this mechanic because their 2 lanes are really similar to a single Hearthstone board, right? So it's not really like you're playing on 2 Hearthstone boards either. It's like you've split a Hearthstone board into 2 non-equal parts, and you play on that a lot of the time. And it's not very interesting or innovative, in my opinion. It adds a little bit of complexity to the game, but not much. And it's not very interesting. So Artifact really kind of does something. I don't want to say it perfects this system, because I think we'll have to wait and see when the game's been out for a while, when the pro scene has been healthy for a while for this game. But I think it's the most interesting and innovative approach we've seen so far to this type of mechanic to add complexity to the game. So that's pretty cool. And I think it draws, I want to say there might be something older than Soulforge that Richard Garfield worked on that did this kind of mechanic, but it basically draws from some of his earlier works. He's kind of been failing his way up to what we eventually are getting with Artifact. So hopefully this is finally the success. Anyway, let's talk about Hearthstone. This is the final thing we really need to cover here in this historical journey. How has Hearthstone impacted Artifact? Because, there were a lot of people, now it's just trolls, but there were a lot of people, especially early on, expecting Artifact to be a Hearthstone clone, it to be Valve's Hearthstone, right? And, Hearthstone is kind of the benchmark now, because, it's more like they're kind of the de facto successful digital card game, because before Hearthstone, and notice the dates here, 2014, that's when Hearthstone came out. This is the first really successful digital card game. Okay, 1993 is when the original came out. I should have listed MTGO on here, but MTGO is a long time before Hearthstone had its success. And I and a lot of other people kept expecting a good quality digital card game for a long time. It just didn't happen. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. And Hearthstone comes out, and Hearthstone is really just, no one else had made a real AAA quality digital card game that took advantage of being a digital card game in any meaningful way. And Hearthstone did that, right? It innovated a little bit on Magic the Gathering, appealed to a little bit of a broader audience, and it just made a quality game that took advantage of being a digital card game in neat ways. And that's all it took. Like, they didn't really need to do anything special. They had an established IP attached, and, Hearthstone is not that innovative. It's like a little bit of a change on the Magic the Gathering formula, and just good quality, and boom, huge success. And it's just kind of one of those things where it was bound to happen, and Blizzard did it before anyone else actually bothered to make a decent AAA digital card game. So of course it was successful. It's very, very unsurprising to me that Hearthstone was successful from the moment I heard about it. When it first released, I 100% expected this to kind of be the outcome. And yeah, So, how has it inspired Artifact? That's its historical significance. I think it's impacted, every game released since it came out. Elder Scrolls Legends, I think, really draws on its sort of combat system and its philosophy of, you go, your opponent goes, do your own thing. None of this Magic the Gathering, pestery interaction nonsense. But how has the impact influenced Artifact? I think how it's influenced Artifact is that it made itself very approachable. I think Artifact is actually more approachable. And let me say what I mean by approachable. What I mean by approachable is for your game to be easy to understand by just looking at it and trying to figure it out, right? And by that I don't necessarily mean like staring at a stream intently and trying to just figure out how the game works. That can be an aspect of it too, but I mean, if you sit down and you try and play a game, just no knowledge going into it, you should be able to play it, probably. Maybe if it's your first game ever of the genre, you might need a tutorial, but I'm sure any of you who have played shooters or anything out there and sit down, some shooter you've never played, fiddle with the buttons a little bit to try and find hotkeys, and you'll be playing it, no problem. Because we have like established conventions, and if a game developer really communicates these well and follows these conventions like WASD or move, you look around with your mouse on the computer, or you look around with the right thumbstick and move with the left thumbstick on Xbox controllers and such. If you follow these conventions and you make your game intuitive, essentially, people can just sit down and play it, and that's approachable. And if you can sit down and play something, you don't have to be good at it, but play it and like actually play it. I mean, like you don't just bumble around unable to really accomplish game objectives, but you can at least shittily sit down and you can shoot the bad guys and you can switch your weapons and find new ammo and pick up new weapons without having to like be given an instruction manual or have the game explained to you by a friend. That's a game that is approachable. And Hearthstone is very approachable. You click and drag everything. The game just kind of like works the way you'd expect it to. If pretty much all the rules are on the card text, and just very easy to understand. Right, pretty simple. And I think Artifact does the same thing. It's obviously not really as easy of a game to understand as Hearthstone, but the automatic combat system, the lack of mulligans. I think they looked at Hearthstone and they thought like, all right, we want our game to have like have complexity, to have depth, to be this like Dota 2 of card games, where there is a lot of depth and complexity for the players who really want a interesting long-term experience, where it's going to take you a long time to learn new things and get better at the game. But we want to take out anything that's really unnecessary to that experience to make it easier to get into for new players. And so I think that's why we have automated combat, right? Hearthstone's like attacking, blocking system that turns creatures into removal is new player friendly in some ways, in the sense that it makes the game a little bit simpler than Magic the Gathering. It makes deck building easier. But in other ways, it focuses you around this sort of low-level math equation type of gameplay, where you just look at the board state and you attack a block to you don't really actually choose blockers, but you trade to optimize it, and if you do it wrong, you know, your position is worsened, and if you do it right, your position is improved, and you're going to be able to learn how to do it right every time for the amount of knowledge you have very quickly, but not immediately, right? There's still going to be an early frustration period. So Artifact's just like, fuck that, let's get that out of there. Let's get players directly into learning about strategy, right? Let's make sure that at the very least, if we want to have this depth of strategy and have this game that's complex and going to be something you're going to be learning for a very long time and take a lot of hours to get very good at, let's at least let players jump directly into improving the kind of skill we want this game to be focused around. I think that's what Artifact accomplishes. I think that's what the goal is, at least. How well it accomplishes it remains to be seen. I think that we can say that to a certain extent it's going to be better in that regard than many other games, because they do cut out pain in the butt kind of hassle mechanics in favor of this more erudite, high-level skill, so to speak. So yeah, anyway, I think that's pretty much it. I think Hearthstone or Artifact has learned some lessons from Hearthstone, but they are very different games. I'm not going to get into the minutia of how and why they are super different. I think perhaps the most obvious one, if perhaps you are the golden goose, the one player out there who actually thought maybe Artifact was a Hearthstone clone. Hearthstone was inspired by and takes most of its mechanics from Magic the Gathering, which was created by Richard Garfield. Richard Garfield, in the meantime, created a lot of games with very different mechanics from Hearthstone and somewhat different mechanics from Magic the Gathering, and he's creating Artifact. If anything, in some ways, Hearthstone is copying mechanics from Artifact's creator, anyway. So, yeah, I think they're very different games in the same genre. A lot more different, actually, than many of the other games on this board. I'd say Hearthstone's way more different. I mean, Elder Scrolls Legends is practically a more Magic the Gathering themed Hearthstone clone. So definitely more in common there. But you know, the earlier games like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh had a lot more in common with Hearthstone and Magic the Gathering as well than Artifact has in common with any of them, I think. But maybe that's just my personal evaluation and a little bias. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video and you'll want to see more content like it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you've got any questions about this, or maybe want to suggest some video content you'd like to see about this game or others, feel free to leave it in the comments down below. That's all for now. Yakri out.